Hello, my name is Henk Vlootman. I'm a data platform MVP. To be very honest, I used to be an Excel MVP, and I have been an Excel MVP for 4 years. But the last 4 years I'm a data platform MVP. That means that most of my time I'm working with Power BI. But my blood always goes where it can go. I surely love Excel. So from my Excel experience, I'm going to tell you in this session something about ranges in Excel and in the way to build proper and efficient Excel models. I have recorded this all before, so you will see something like a continuing movie, but I will be around in this session to answer your questions on what I'm presenting. Thank you very much, and I hope you will enjoy this session. Right, let's talk about table or range principles. If you look at Excel, Excel is based on cells, and you can do anything in a cell. Knowing that, the cell is defined by a column number, a column letter, and a row number. H1 is the first left upper cell in the sheet. But if you look at the range, Excel knows something about the range because it's defined by the first empty column left to right and the first empty row above and below. Knowing that, you need to know another little thing more. If you look at the range over here in row 8, colored in blue, is a header. And this header is important because it's based on the fact that there is something like a range over here. And if I should use a filter, data tab filter, you can see that the filter will be placed on the header row, the first row in the range. And that means, looking at that first row will not be used as being a calculation row. If I click on my filter, you can see that it will select everything uniquely in that column, except that the name of my header is not there. So the first row within a range will not be recognized. So there's something else which is called the row context. And the row context means that if you look logically from left to right in the Netherlands, then you can read out what's in this row. So say this is a transaction, and then we know in cell B10 there's my client, and it bought at the 2nd of July 2020 8 numbers of something with a unit price of 8. And if I fill in my amount, there should be 8 times 8, 64 in cell H10. Since it's all based on one row, the row is the transactional reading. So be aware that if you sort something in a range, that you sort a complete range. Otherwise, your row context will be gone, and it's just say it's useless then. Another thing which happens with the column context is that you need to know that every column has a data type. Looking at, for instance, my clients column, which is column D, those are text. And if I look at my date, that's a date. And in column F and G, we talk about whole numbers. It is really very important to keep in mind that your data type is correct. And one of the things you really need to avoid is this. If you look at this section, you can see that there is a bad column context. There is a date, there's a whole number, there's a decimal number, there's text in the Boolean. You're not able to create correct calculations on it, except if you go back to the cell base. So I can add something like D77 and D78 together in a separate cell, but then I work on cell base, not on a range base. So keep in mind that within the range you want to have the same data types. The definition of an Excel range. What you see over here is an Excel file with two ranges. The range is built up by the definition. It needs to have a first empty column on the left and on the right side, and it looks at the first empty row above and below. So if I have a series of information cells filled, and I click in one of the cells filled, and I use my Control asterisk key, and then it will select my range. So if I go to the other range, like this one over here, and do again the Control asterisk, it will select that range. As you can see, Excel is smart enough to know where it starts, and that's why if you use a filter, that the filter will always be added on the top line, the above line of your range, and that will enhance all unique numbers within the complete range. Having said that, it's very important to understand how ranges works. The moment I, for instance, add a number in cell F7, for instance 5, like this, and I'll try again what is my range, then that range will be extended. As you can see, it will now work from D7 until F13. And that's not all, because it looks at the first empty row. So if I go like, say, something over here, and I'll type 6 over here, and in my adjusted cell 7, and I try it again, then you shall see that the complete range has extended to H. And that's because there is the first empty column on the right will not be F, G, or H, but will be I. So that means that this is a bit of a problem within your Excel file, because having said this, the first line now is not the line I want to have. And if I click on this cell over here, this one, and I do it again, then you shall see that there is another range within the range, which only has the 6 and the 7 in it, G and H 13. That means this is something like a hybrid range, and that's not nice to work. If you really want to work quite well in Excel, then you need to keep in mind that what is belonging to each other needs to be in one range, and that what will not be belong to each other will not be in one range. Working with large ranges can be very difficult. If I click, for instance, in this range, and I don't know how large this range is, I can use my mouse and my mouse wheel, and I can wheel forever to get to the end of the range. If you know some shortcuts, life will be much easier. If I stand somewhere in a range and I use the Control key in conjunction with the arrow keys, so in this case I'll take the down arrow, I will go to the end of my range. If I do it again, I'll come to the edge of my worksheet, because if there's no range in between, it will just stop at the end of the range, which is quite logic. If I go to the other side of my range and I use the Control arrow key, but then the key to the right, it will go flip to the end of my sheet, You can see it will end at the last column that is available in my sheet. Using the control and the left arrow will bring me back to the edge of my range. If I want to be quickly on top, I use the control home key to get to the A1 cell. So if I'm in the range myself, it's better to use the control and the asterisk key to select the whole range. If the range is selected, then I can use the control period key to find the edges of my range. This is better than the control arrow keys, because if there's somewhere down in cell H2000 the value, then automatically my range will be larger, and then I know that my range is not pure. That there are cells adjunct to it which shouldn't be addressed like that. I should have then a header, for instance, and I don't have it. So using the control period means that I switch between the corners of my range, and as you can see with that, the active cell will also change to that the corners of the range. If you have selected a range like this, it's easy to copy and paste. You can do it by using Control C, Control V, or copy paste from the home menu. But you can also move it by get to the edge of my range, use the mouse key and just drag it a little bit away. It takes a little while, because be aware that this is 6 columns with more than 1 million rows, so I'm moving 6 million rows in one time. If you talk about the least known feature in Excel, you're talking about the name box. And the name box is very, very important if you want to work with ranges and if you want to work with navigation in cells. So the name box is here, as you can see, in the upper left corner, and you can click in it, and then your address, which is your standard address, which is now cell A1, will be getting blue. If you type in another address like AZ568 and you press enter, and that will be the active cell. If you want to go home, control home and you'll be hit 1. But if you want to say, well, perhaps I'm interested in cell J 8900-568 and I press the enter button, you see that you will end up at that cell. So knowing where your positions are within ranges means that it's quite easy to navigate to a range if you know where it starts and where it ends. It's very important to keep in mind that this name box has multiple functions. It's, for instance, a function where you can navigate, as we can do so, but it's also a function where you can use to create names on certain points. Let's have a moment of thought about the 2 types of calculations you can find in Excel. Well, I hear you say 2 types of calculations. Yes, basically there are 2 types of calculations. And it has to do with the fact that you have a column and a row context in Excel. So if you look over here, I have a row context, and if I want to have my amount, I can multiply my number sold by my units, and I can do it by row and then copy it down. Within a couple of seconds I will show you that. That is one of the types of calculation that is around. And the other type of calculation is what we call an aggregate calculations. If you want to know the total number of numbers sold, you can sum this range column and the number is the total number of salts. That's an aggregation calculation, and there's a huge difference between them. If you are using pivot tables, you always use in the value box in the right below section of your pivot table modification tab, and you always will use an aggregate function over there. It will be summing something, it will be an average, it will be a max. That's always looking at a range and looking at the aggregation of that range and find the desired calculations. So having said that, let's see how some basic calculations work. If I go over to this sheet, I got the same layout as I had in the sheet before with the colors, but if I want to know my sales, I can just press the equal sign, get to the cell I want, use the multiple sign, and then go to the yellow cell which I want to multiply with. As you can see, this is a row context calculation. If I push enter, I got the number. And probably, if you don't know, there's a fill handle over here, and you can use the fill handle by dragging it down, and it will then copy the calculation downwards. But if I'm in a row context, I can also use the little dot in the bottom, the fill handle, and just double click on it, and it will be filled until the end of the range. Knowing this, if you look at how it's done, you can see that if I look how the calculations are made of, calculations will be added up when I copy down. So D6 will be D7, will be D8, will be D9, will be D10, and so on and so forth. Using this kind of techniques means that making a row calculation is very, very easy. There's just one little downside by it. You need to create a calculation for each row in your range. And if you have a long range, that can be a problem. So if I want to use something like my VAT, value added text, in the Netherlands it will be 21%. And if I want to add it over here, I want to add the VAT value multiplied by my sales. So I know what my VAT value will be. I can use basically the same formula, equal signs, get cell B6, click on cell B6, F6, I'm sorry, F6, multiply that cell by cell Y1. And if I'm doing this, it will give me the VAT of my sales. But if I copy it down, it will not work, because if you really look close to it, and I take the second one, then you can see that it will also be dependent on the fact that it will also lower my cell Y1 to Y2, and that's what I don't want. So getting over here and getting the formula, I can type dollar signs in it. It's easier to use when you're on the edit mode. So if you can see your cursor blinking in the cell reference, you can also use the F4 key, and that means that you got $2 with it. Using that and copying again the cell about the range, fill handle, double click, means that now every cell is filled with an absolute link to my Y1. And you can see that the link I didn't touch with it, which has no dollar signs in it, will be changed from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the other will stay on the 1. So getting calculation done in a row context is very important to know how to use your dollar signs. And a dollar signs makes a a reference absolute. No dollar signs means that you don't have an absolute reference. So now it's easy to calculate the total by just using equal sign, taking my cell F6, multiply it with G6 and use again the fill handle to copy it down. Looking at this kind of way of working in row context calculations, and if you distinguish how it works, it is really a fast way of working. If you use names within ranges, the navigation is a bit easier and your formulas are more readable. Let's look at our example over here. We got our total and we want to multiply that with our VAT. And the VAT placed in I1, 21%, and as you can see in the name box, the name of it is I1, but I can change that. If I click into the name box, wait until it's blue, and then change the name in something which is meaningful for me. For instance, VAT, which is a name, but it shouldn't be a reference to a cell. So if I change it in VAT1, then I will move to that cell. But if I put it without any number of anything else, and I use this name, I do enter, and now this cell has this name. So if I'm somewhere in another sheet, and I decided to think, what was my VAT? I go to my name box, click on it, and you can see all the names are below it. So I can click on that name and go to that name. And I can use that name. So if I'm standing over here in H6, use the equal sign, get my G6, multiply this one, and then I use VAT, and as you see it's over there as a name, and if I enter it, it will go like this. And if I double click on the fill handle, it will fill until the end of the range. And have a look at how it looks. You can see that now it's full stated that it's G6, G7, G8, G9, G10, and all are multiplied by the VAT. That means that name has an absolute reference. And you can see that if you go to the name manager, which you can find in the tab formulas, and if you look in the ribbon and you got your name manager over here, and if you click on the name manager, you find the name back and with the reference with it. So if you want to change the position of your name, you have to change it over here. As you just saw, you can create a name on a cell. Like here, the name will be VAT. But you can also create a name on a range, or a column in a range, or a row in a range. It should always be a rectangle in the way you select cells. So if I select D6 until D10, then I got a rectangle shape which started at D6 and ended at D10, and I can change this name in something like number sold. As you can see, spaces are not allowed, so I don't use it. And I can change this same amount in unit price. So what happens if I'm standing a little bit away and I say, well, what was my unit price? I go to my unit price and here you are. This is my unit price. With the new Excel, there are new features added in arrays. And usually you should end an array with a certain kind of keyboard key. So you could use the Control, the Shift and the Enter to create an array. But in the new Excel, those things are changed. If you want to know more about the ranges, dynamic arrays, you can find sessions for that in this event. So if I'm going over here and I'm on cell F6, that is the upper top of the range I want to fill, and I use the F3 key, then I get my name. So as I say, I got my number sold, okay, and I multiply that with F3 my unit price, and I do enter. It will all be filled. And as you can see on the top level, it has a dark black font, and if you go a bit lower, then the font in your range will become gray. There are a couple of things about this. The first one, if I add the first one and I delete it, I deleted everything. But if I go a bit lower and I try to delete one of those below and I press the delete key, as you can see, that will not work. So this is the way things work dynamically with names. As I told you, working with names makes your formula much more readable. If you look at the model over here, we had a name which is fed over here, but I used also a name for my unit price and sold, number sold, and the unit price. As you can see, this is a nice, neat way of reading things. As I told you, this is an array function, and the array function will fill up itself until the end of the array is found. So it's standing here as one formula, but in actuality it's covering all the ranges that are made by my number sold and my unit price. So I can also create another column for the VAT, and I'll take this column over here and call this column sales. And now I can create a formula which says F3 using my sales and multiply that with F3 giving my VAT over here, and it will fill up automatically. And if I take this column and I call this column, I cannot call it VAT because that's all a name which is occupied by my VAT 21%. So I'll call this column VAT, no space of course, and I can then say, okay, F3, do my sales, multiply by F3, the column with the VAT on it. Keep in mind, I push the enter key, it's filled up. Keep in mind that it's important that you think thoroughly of how the names you create, how to name those names. Most of the time I use something like LST for a list, col for a column, row for a row, var for a variable. So the VAT is a variable and it should be var VAT, for instance. So there are always ways you can recognize what kind of range you connect with a name. That is an important structuring rule. If I look what's happening now, everything is beautifully made up. You can see that it's all correctly set up, and my formulas are much more readable. So we just discussed how to make row context calculations within a range, and as you can see, it will work out very fine. But there is also something which is called an aggregate calculation. So perhaps I want to have the total sum of my column H, which is my total sales. So if I stand on the cell beneath it and I use the AutoSum, you can find it in the tab Formulas AutoSum, or you find it in the Home tab where you also find the AutoSum. And if you press that button, it will calculate, give you the idea which column to take to sum. As you can see, this is a rather funny way of describing this column. It's called H6 hash, and it will work like this. So this will sum my H6. Actually, this is not the correct place to have a formula, an aggregate formula, because if I go into my range and select the range by using Control asterisk, you see that it now belongs to that range. It doesn't belong to the range, it's a completely different thing, it's a calculation. So if you really want to be sure that Excel knows what's in that range, you really need to move it away from it. So you can just get to the corners and move it away. And if I have one empty row between it, it's okay, because if I'm now selecting my range, it will select it without the calculation. And that's much better anyway, because if you want to work quite nicely, the bottom of the table is not the correct place for having some aggregation functionals. You really want to have them in top, because if you go down and you split your screen over here, then this will always be visible. And if it goes down and your table grows, you don't know where you end. So if it ends something like H 9225, well, that's hard to go by. Of course, you can use the name box to get there, but it's better to put it on top and show the hierarchy within it. This is something which is not normally done, but I use it a lot. So keeping my ranges clean is very, very necessary. Working within ranges, there's a difference, as said, in working with row context calculations or aggregated calculations. And let's see the difference in time, because if you look at performance, you really need to know which way is better. So let's look at our model over here. I've done some things, and if you look at the range over here, and will select the range and use the control dots to get to the points, you can see it's nearly completed filled the sheet. That means that looking at here, there is a huge amount of columns filled, rows filled, rows, which is approximately more than a million rows. Now, if you look at the formula in H3, you can see it is the F3 times the G3, and that is a row context calculation. Now, if I use the fill handle and double click on the fill handle, the complete range will be filled with this calculation, but that will take time. If I'll do it, I'll just count for you. Here we go. It's double click 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Around 10 seconds. Now, if I remove this sum over here and I'll make the sum here of my total sales, then I'll like to sum this range. So let's see if we can do it. It is sum. I start at the beginning of the range over here. I use the shift and the control key, put those down, arrow button down. I have now, as you can see, selected the whole range. I ended this one with a bracket, and if I push enter, the calculation is now be done. It's quite nearly direct. This is more than 1,000,000 rows. So if it is possible, you try to avoid using a row context calculation. So if I need to know my total sales and I want to do it without a row calculation on the H column, I should use names. So I created two names. The one is a large amount, that is this range, and as you can see, the range will go completely through the complete table range. And I also have created a large sales, which is the same context, but then on the sales price. So if I create a sum over here without using the sales column, it would look like this. This sum of my large amount times my large, and now a large sales. Closing brackets. So now I'm using two ranges, and using the ranges and put enter, you can see that it will calc almost directly. So the row calculation I've done over here means that there's more than 1,000,000 calculations, and that is not the most efficient way to calculate within Excel. So you preferably like to use aggregated calculations in which you create some things like this. The set down of this, of course, is that if you want to select on a sales date or something else like that and you don't have a sales column, this will not work well. In that case, you should probably use something like a pivot table or some ifs. So let's talk about a way you don't want to use your row calculations, and that is when you do something like what we call a mixed formula. In column H you find all kinds of calculations. It's a row context calculation, and that row context will always be something like on the row level F times G, and then based on every row which is in this range. One of the things you shouldn't never ever do, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is if you say, oh, hold on, look at this formula. This is a nice formula. The returns is 612, and let's say it needs a correction, and I add 8 to this calculation, like this. As you can see, Excel nowadays displays a warning that the formula in this cell differs from other formulas in this area of the spreadsheet, and that's correct. But if this correction should happen somewhere in row 10,000 or 50,000, you will never ever find it. And if some data changed and this cell will be recalculated, that 8 will always be there. So one of the main things you should never do is put input into something like a formula. So the way to handle this is not getting the 8 behind this formula, but leave the formula intact and create a column that says correction. And if I add my correction 8 in this column and I update all, but all the formulas in my range with the correction cell on it in row level, and I just set this one through, then you should see that, did I do it correctly? It's still calculating, I'm sorry. That's the point of row context calculations. It takes a while, but when it's finished, and it's not yet finished too, you can see now it's changed in the 620. And if I remove this one, the number will be okay. The main advantage of this kind of systems using a correction column is that you can add anywhere your correction, and that correction will be just shown here, so you know that there is a correction on this row context calculation. And if it's not necessary to correct it anymore, you can just remove it and it will be done. So in this way, you should always try to make your formulas that it has no input value in it. It may only point to cells where you can find your data. And that means that in Excel you've got two kinds of cells. I got cells with my input, and I got cells with calculation, and there is no more in between. So a mixed formula with input in it is a recipe to disaster. Never ever do that. Some tips about creating Excel models that are fast and reliable. One of the things you should know is that there's an order in calculations. So if I got my table over here and I look at my formulas in that table, you see that my formulas are right over there. And they're close to each other. I try to make my formulas in a way that it's the items you need are close together. Preferable in the same worksheet, but if we continue later on, we will find that that's not always possible. And in the case here, my calculations will be on both sides of my calculation columns. What you need to know is that there is a direction in calculation in Excel in a spreadsheet. In a sheet, if you have a sheet over here, it will be calculated from the left top until the right bottom of all the formulas in a worksheet. So if you are clever and try to make your model as fast as possible, work in blocks of ranges that are stacked beneath each other from the left top, where the first calculations need to be, until the end of my ranges, which are blocked in between, underneath each other. Keep in mind that one of the things which makes a model slower is that what I call sheet hopping. That means I got a formula over here, and that refers to another sheet, and there's a formula in that sheet that will refers to another sheet, and there it will refers to a fourth sheet. And if Excel needs to do a recalculation from the right bottom to that calculation, the calculation is on its way and it needs to hop to another page. Oh dear, that needs to be updated too. So I'll need to hop to another page and again to another page, and that will cost time. So if you want to be working in Excel in a very disciplined way, you try to keep all your calculations in one sheet from the left top until the right bottom. It has another kind of advantage. all your calculations are within one sheet, and those calculations can just be easily tracked. You don't have to look where it goes on another sheet. It should be pointed to the same sheet. That means if you use this kind of tactics, that you use your sheets for formatting your model. I got sheets which are preferably for input. I got sheets preferably for calculations. I got sheets for variables. I got sheets for output. And having all those separate sheets means that I know where things happen. I will not find any calculations in my sheet input. I can only find them in calculations. I will not find any calculations in my output sheet because there aren't any calculations over there. My output should be a link to cells or ranges or named ranges within my calculation sheet. And using this kind of techniques makes your worksheet quite fast. To wrap up the session, I'll show you a model that's built on ranges and names, and it starts with, as you can see, a dashboard. And in the dashboards I have a couple of different kinds of controls in which I can have a graph and a table, and that will be changed accordingly to what I'm selecting. So if I'm selecting at this moment, for instance, another Dutch mentioned customer type, then you can see that everything will change to that customer type. And the moment I skip a year, so for instance say that I'll skip 2011, and then you can see that the bar of 2011 will be gone. If I add them, they will be added as well. I can change all kinds of things if it's by cubic meter or by the price of the payments. I can change it in type of family, and all those graphs and table will be adjusted accordingly to what I have selected over here. And it's all been done by input. These are all manual input, so I'll take, for instance, the tables of the scenarios, and I'll need these tables, and that gives me all kinds of information: year types, index numbers. I got all kinds of firms. I got all kinds of persons, and all those things over here will be combined and give me two calculation sheets. And I'm just looking at the last one, that's this one, and here everything happens with my control. Everything will be calculated over here. And unfortunately, this is the wrong way of calculations. I learned that later. Those are going from down to up, and it should be from up to down. But you can see the results at the moment. I'll change one thing. So if I look over here, this is the table which creates my graph, for instance. And the moment I'll go back to my dashboard, and I'll remove let's say 2008. So in my graph 2008 will be gone, and if I look at my calculations over here, you can see that there is a change, and 2001 has now another number, which is not a year anymore, and that means that it will be fallen out of my graph. As you can see, it's not listed in over here, and that means that here needs to be something like a formula that sorts this column, and everything which is higher than 10,000 will not be shown. So those are typical things that you need to address the moment you start using this kind of building techniques. Keep in mind that is practice and a lot of experience. So if you want to create things like this, start with small models. One of the other last sheets I like to see in this review is where my system variables are. So here all my variables will be selected and replaced. Those are all kinds of control that give me a true or false back, and accordingly to the true or false it will do something. This is my year list, and here at the end I have all the names I use in this model are listed over here in column Q and R, and these are all names I made and used to create the correct calculations.